Welcome back to another episode of Things You Don't Know. I'm Dr. Denis.
And I'm Dr. Weaver. Today's topic shapes the borders of public thought itself. What is it? What is it? It's the Overton window. Have you ever heard a radical idea and thought, that's never going to happen? Turns out sometimes it does. And what makes it wild is this: politicians don't usually lead the window. They follow it. It's activists, clergy, media, and even parents who drag it left, right, or deeper into truth. What in the heck is this that we're talking about? The Overton window is a spectrum of ideas the public will accept. In other words, what people might be able to accept and think was okay. Joseph P. Overton, a former vice president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, developed it. He proposed that the viability of a political idea is determined more by whether it's within this window of acceptability than by the preferences of politicians and other leaders themselves. How the window works? It is both more simple in imagination and more complex in its details than one might think. The window shifts over time, and it usually contains the following range of points: whether it's unthinkable, how radical it is it really kind of acceptable, and is it sensible? In other words, it's a gradient, right?
Absolutely.
And other things. Is it popular? Should we make it policy? Ideas at the policy end are those that can be realistically enacted, while those at the unthinkable end are too far outside societal norms. And let's also remember that it can shift in both ways. For example, back in the days of the great philosophers that we laud and think were so brilliant, like, say, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, if a child was born and it had an obvious defect, what did they do? They put it in a pit outside town, and the people in the town would come and stone the thing until it was dead. And they'd leave it for the wolves or other animals to eat. Now, that would be totally unacceptable today. So, what was popular then moved back up that spectrum, if you will, or down the spectrum, however you want to visualize it. So you see, it can move in both directions. Am I not right, Dr. Dane?
You're quite right. And things do evolve over time. Let's look at another area that would have been seen for a long time as unworthy of discussion, same-sex marriage. In the world of the mid 20th century, attraction to same-sex people, being gay or lesbian, much less bi, trans, or anything else we call it today, let alone a lifetime commitment, was stigmatized as the love that dared not speak its name. It was considered a sin by most religions and was against the law throughout all the democratic nations of the West. This begins to change as a result of newer attitudes, second wave feminism, and civil rights in the 1960s. After the Stonewall protests, which are a riot on a raid on some gay bars in New York, a small fringe group begins advocating for changes, first for tolerance, then later on for broader acceptance. The AIDS crisis happens in the 1980s, and the initial panic turns to a greater level of toleration at first and some degree of understanding. So by the 1990s, society began to become more willing to entertain the possibility of a genuine state sanctioned commitment for same sex couples. They wouldn't call it marriage for a long time. The term civil union, domestic partnership was used in order to allow people to inherit their partner's money, make medical decisions for them in times of crisis, and so on. But by the early 2000s, the idea of a stable monogamous relationship for same sex couples was seen as, if not entirely desirable, first acceptable, then it becomes sanctioned and popular. And by 2015, gay marriage is legalized across the United States. It becomes national policy.
Interestingly enough, the current administration is trying to reverse that. We'll see. I don't think that will fly with the American public. Anyhow, who shifts the window? Who makes these shifts? Well, activists and advocates on both the left and the right. The media, yeah, they play a big role. And we have to be very, very careful not to put constraints on the free press. And by that, I don't just mean newspapers, which hardly exist anymore. I mean news media. We have to recognize that certain things are entertainment. Say, for example, Fox News, which in their own words is not licensed as a news station. It's licensed as entertainment station. Academia is another one. Well, academia, how does that happen? Well, people do research, people talk about it, people start thinking, and sometimes the logic of something different just strikes home and they start promoting it. And once that happens, the future leaders become more accustomed to the idea and perhaps they promote it to some extent. Another group is religious or cultural leaders. For example, the Pope, and this was something that was rather interesting to me, Dr. Deneen, when I asked you what the current view on what happens to domesticated animals after they die, because in the past, if they died, they ceased to exist. And what did you tell me? And why did you tell me that?
Well, I heard a discussion by Pope Leo saying that animals have a soul similar to human beings. It's not quite exactly the same, but that same divine spark. So a child had asked the Pope whether his favorite pets would be with him in heaven. And the pontiff replied that he believed that it was so because he did not believe in a loving God who would deny anyone the consolation of human beings or fellow creatures of his that he had created that they loved.
The other group that actually moves the window are politicians. Now, they're not the leaders in it. They usually only do this after others have moved the window, sort of getting ahead of the people. You know what I mean?
Yes, they tend to jump on a bandwagon rather than create it. You're quite right. Let's look at practice we regard as universally abhorrent today, but was quite acceptable at one time. And that's the horror of slavery, particularly a racial-based slavery, such as in North America and Europe. I'm ashamed to admit that great philosophers, Plato, Socrates, the biblical prophets, even Jesus Christ himself, said very little against slavery. And so people believed in this racial aspect. It wasn't that way in the Roman or Ottoman empires, it was more a political thing. But so at the beginning of American existence, there was an agricultural based economy. So it was seen as unthinkable to end slavery, even in the British Empire, the most liberal area of the world at that time, much less in what would become the United States. But attitudes began to change as a result of the American Revolution, which freed many slaves through service in both the American and British armies. The first seeds of doubt were planted about the morality of this practice. A group of formerly enslaved people, two of whom I've done podcasts on, one of my first podcasts, Caesar Drake in the United States, who is buried not too far from here, and whose the discovery of his grave started this podcast. And Harry Washington, who migrates to Canada, George Washington's former dog keeper. Check out our podcast on him as well. To mention only two of thousands, demonstrate through their lives the immorality of owning, buying, and selling human beings. This leads to a gradual alteration of thought. Great abolitionist leaders, William Wilberforce in Britain, Frederick Douglass in the United States, spent decades arousing the moral conscience of the nation, saying, how can a nation that calls itself a free society keep human beings in chains? The rise of African governed states like Haiti and Liberia changed the mind, shows that people were capable of administering their own affairs. So all of these awful racial hierarchies didn't make any sense, as well as being immoral. So after more than a century, a number of policy changes happen. Abolition happens in the British Empire in the 1830s, 1833. There hadn't been no slavery in the UK itself. In the United States, after the Civil War or the Emancipation Proclamation during the war and passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865, and other nations follow suit. The last nation to get rid of slavery is Mauritania in North Africa, and that doesn't happen until the 1920s.
Wow.
Amazing.
Yes, it is. Another area, universal suffrage. It was unthinkable for women and non-property owners in early democracies to have suffrage. What do we mean by suffrage? We mean the right to vote,
Yes.
okay? And to make decisions. The only ancient culture we covered this too was what was it there?
Sparta in ancient Greece.
Sparta. Yeah, the great military power, and they had women at home who ran the show basically because the guys were off there fighting. Uh, but anyhow, it was radical in the 1800s. Think of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. It became acceptable marginally during World War I as women filled men's roles. There's some great uh, posters that came out during that time, especially that one of the woman with her muscled arm doing factory work. You remember that one,
Indeed.
Dr. Neem.
Indeed.
So policy by the 1920s in much of the West started shifting, changing. Others shifted the peoples who were responsible, the suffragettes, journalism, the journalists, World War I, and also religious reformers.
It's very ironic, just to speak of that briefly. In Utah, when it was run as a private territory of the Latter-day Saint Mormon Church, women had voting rights as early as the 1870s, along with polygamy. So you wouldn't think those two things would exist in the same society, but they did.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about interfaith dialogue. Actually, a relatively important thing that people just don't really talk about a whole lot, and maybe we should. It was interfaith dialogue was pretty much unthinkable in the medieval period. Jews, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists had mostly hostile relations, if not hostile in the case of Buddhists, kind of just not dealing with it. We can't ignore the shift among many Protestant churches in how they view Catholicism. Yeah, once Catholics were seen as heretics, idolaters, even antichrist figures by some reformers. In 19th century America, anti-Catholic sentiment fueled political movements like the Know Nothings. And even before that, there was a great problem back as far as the Revolutionary War. Correct, Dr. Deneen?
Yes, you're quite correct. The colony of Maryland had actually been created as a haven for Catholics because within most of the rest of the colonies, there was a state religion. And even if there was not out and out persecution, people that belonged to other Protestant denominations, much less Catholicism or Judaism, couldn't vote in some areas, had to pay extra taxes, all kinds of things.
Yeah,
It
and didn't that also affect whether Canada joined in the Revolutionary War?
it did. John Dickinson, the great,
we did a podcast about that.
we did. John Dickinson, the great politician who's so famous in the film and play 1776, actually writes a declaration to our Canadian brethren, trying to get them involved in the cause on the American side. Check out our Moses Hazen podcast for some pro-American Canadians and the role the Catholic Church played in that.
Anyhow, it did start to change. Post World War II ecumenical movements shared Christian values in the face of secularism, and mutual defense of life and family helped to shift the tone.
Also, the reforms in the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s in the Catholic Church, its emphasis on dialogue, opened many doors. Just to tell very briefly, my dear friend, Dr. Andrew Kramer, one of the pioneers of the physical therapy movement that we did another podcast on, he was Catholic and his wife was Lutheran, and she did not convert. And he was pressured to either not marry her or to really demand that she join the Catholic Church. And he said, no, God is too big to be in one group. So they lived a happy married life for 63 years, each believing what they believed.
Yeah.
But now you see an ecumenical approach, evangelical and Catholic cooperations on social issues, shared pulpit during prayer events, joint doctrinal statements. During the civil rights era, in the famous Selma film, you see the head of the Orthodox Church, Roman Catholic nuns, and evangelical Adventists all marching against Bull Connor and the Ku Klux Klan. So the Overton window moves things from tolerance, from hostility to grudging tolerance to a genuine fraternity in many corners of what used to be called Christendom. Not everyone agrees. What was once unthinkable is now lived by millions. A Methodist pastor embracing a Catholic and Orthodox bishop, a Baptist elder quoting Pope Francis. These are signs of grace and of history unfolding. As I like to say, as a person of faith myself, the Holy Spirit is never constrained by a policy manual. This also happens in other less westernized religions. Let's talk about Buddhism, Shintoism, and even Islam. These traditions are often seen as timeless, unchanging, but even here the Overton window moves. In the Buddhist circles, the idea that monks could be active in politics or social protest was once seen as a corruption of their mission of the sacred Dharma. But in the 20th century, figures like Tai Hat Han redefined engaged Buddhism.
Actually, one of the other things that happened there that I think perhaps started moving the needle, so to speak, we can remember the famous picture of a Buddhist monk in Vietnam immolating, in other words, setting himself on fire.
Oh, dear heavens, yes, that was a horrible thing, but he was protesting what he saw as discrimination by a Catholic dominated government over there. And he was not the only person that did that. This happens in the Shinto faith also. Remember our MacArthur podcast that looks at that. But after World War II, Japan's spiritual and nationalistic identity underwent a deep transformation. The state religion that had once deified the emperor and supported the empire now champions ecological harmony, tolerance, and cultural peace. And Islamic scholarship? For centuries, certain discussions on democracy, interfaith respect, much less gender equity, were considered out of bounds. But today, scholars from Cairo in Egypt to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia are pushing new interpretations that once would have been condemned.
And
That are,
considered heresy.
yes, there's a rise of Islamic feminism, reinterpretation of the Quran, and calls for pluralism, something that the fundamentalists in Iran or ISIS would not like. But it's all signs of a deepening awareness and a shifting Overton window. What's once unspeakable is now debated in seminaries and mosques all over the world. Great rabbis like Abraham Heschel, Pope John the 23rd, survivors of the Holocaust, the World Council of Churches, and other ecumenical organizations have made these change is possible. Now, let's look at something that, as a person with an exceptionality, I've struggled with, and that's the attitude towards isolation and institutionalization. In the early 1900s, at the height of the so-called eugenics movement, institutionalizing any person with any kind of exceptionality was mainstream. It was
Okay, now
forced.
I just want to interrupt you. I want to make sure that our audience knows precisely what we're talking about when you said the eugenics movement. What we're talking about is killing these people.
Yes, killing them, or at the very least, sterilizing them, isolating them from society, putting them in horrible institutions. And this
And
was,
this was considered a sensible thing,
yes,
medically necessary,
I know that.
purifying to the culture.
Yes, I know people as late as the mid 70s that were forcibly sterilized against their will, personal friends of mine. So it's something I take very seriously. But activists, beginning in the 1960s and 70s, people like Ed Roberts, Dr. Robert Russell, the great blind activist, and others, argue that institutions are both cruel and isolating. Today, many see large scale institutionalization as morally indefensible. Parent advocates, people advocating for themselves, the Rehab Act and its successor, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, that leads to another issue that scares the hell out of people, and that is the idea of romance or sexuality among people with exceptionalities, that we might date, marry, or, God forbid, have children. This notion met resistance for a long time, but it is now seen as sensible and morally correct. I'm worried that might be changing again with some of these newer ideas, but it's not the battle has not yet been entirely won. There's still arguments for sterilization, discrimination in child custody, uh, parents with exceptionalities not being allowed custody of their children. But the battle is still being fought and won. People like my dear friend Brooke Ellison, who graduated from Harvard despite being a quadriplegic on a ventilator. Arthur Sills, the great civil rights and attorney general advocate. Um, Litigators for the ADA, a group that got the Black Panthers and the John Birch Society to work together. Inclusive sex ed programs, mothers fighting for custody in spite of cerebral palsy and even Down syndrome.
Yeah, indeed. Let's turn our focus to speech and cognitive disabilities. Well, uh, it was unthinkable at one point that somebody with no verbal speech could lead or advocate. Yeah. It was radical. The use of devices like augmentative and alternative communication, that could be something that gives the somebody able to listen to what they had to say, as well as Braille and other devices like that. Now, after figures like Temple Grandin, who was the advocate for a more human approach to autism, and the rise of autistic self-advocacy started changing that, started moving the needle. Some systems now require voice output tech access, though funding and recognition do lag. Some of the window shifters here were self-advocates, educators, parents who refused to give up, and therapists who listened. Another person that had something to do with some of that is Henry Ford. Yeah, I'm talking about the great anti-Semite and the person who was just really on the wrong side of this issue, in my opinion, who had a revelation. And we are going to do a podcast soon coming up about what made him change that. It wasn't just thinking about it. There were some things that happened, and we're going to get our intellectual shovels out, right, to Dr. Deneen, and find out what it was.
Yes, there is a chapter in his autobiography called How the Cripple Can Earn Full Wages. Although the term is a little outdated, I always get a sense of somewhat wry amusement when I read that chapter.
So, yeah, looking at disability rights from pity to personhood. The, Dr. Deneen have CP, but I would say I would put him up against any historian that I have ever met in most every aspect. And that does sort of get me fired up.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Dr. Weaver, if I may say so. I mean, I was blessed with a mother who moved heaven and earth to give me access to books and grandparents, God rest their souls, who traveled with me and encouraged me to think and read. I had many wonderful people in my life, and I'm deeply grateful for that.
Yeah. And, this idea of pity, I mean, it may sound nice. Oh, poor thing. Can't do this or can't do that. Screw that. Uh, have you ever felt like I pitied you, Dr. Deneen?
No, if
No.
anything,
And
you
I push you hard sometimes.
you do, and there are times I'm grateful for it, and frankly, there are times it drives me nuts, but I see the value of it, which is why I make an effort to listen to you and look at things from your point of view.
The thing. Mothers began saying, my child will go to school. My daughter will speak. My son will live with me, not be put in an institution. The Overton window creaked open. The ADA, the independent living movement, and self advocates, they made what once seemed radical into law, and they are still pushing it further, a cause that I absolutely support. Talk about the disabled sexuality. Once the idea that disabled people might love, marry, or raise children was unthinkable. It's still somewhat contested, and there may be some angles of it that are very, very complex and difficult to deal with. Sometime I'll tell a story about a person that I knew that, yeah, did some very bad things. So it's still contested. Some activists, especially women with disabilities, are forcing the issue into the realm of the acceptable. And the voice technology, the augmentatives, AAC, autistic self advocacy, proof that silence does not mean ignorance. This window has moved. And, you know, um, here's a little tidbit fact. Um, and I've mentioned this to you before. It is estimated that around 35% of surgeons, aha, yes, board certified surgeons, good surgeons, are on the spectrum. They're autistic. That surprises some people.
It surprised me the first time you said it,
Yeah.
but it makes sense because of their attention to detail and strict routines and so on. But
Mhm.
these windows can not only apply to personal lives, but to diplomacy as well. For example, the US China relationship is a strong testimony to how the Overton window can move geopolitics. For decades after the communist takeover in 1949, any official contact between the United States and Beijing was unthinkable. Recognition was out of the question. We retained recognition of the Republic of China on Taiwan and even sought to unleash Chiang Kai shek, as it was called in some periods. But then came President Nixon in 1972. For a number of reasons, including a desire to widen the split between Moscow and Beijing, he takes a visit to China that shocks the world. Suddenly, what had been seen as radical became sensible and soon enough policy. Now, today, that window is shifting again. There are rising tensions over trade, the contrast of one of the last communist states in the world in mainland China with a capitalist economy and Taiwan's democratic viewpoint and global influence. Things that are once considered mainstream, such as economic integration, are now being reconsidered. What was policy is becoming controversial again. Some are calling for decoupling, others warn against it. Once again, we're watching the window in motion.
And let's not forget ideas like permanent most favored nation status. Let's define that. It's the idea of no restrictions on Chinese trade, uh, and some others too. Once taboo, became normalized, but normalization can be undone almost as quickly as it was forged. We're now in the midst of, you know, considering all kinds of embargoes, tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. Um, mm, and I have my own opinions about that. But let's finish with psychology. For much of the 20th century, mental illness was seen as something to be hidden, institutionalized, or even punished. Homosexuality was listed in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as a mental disorder until 1973. Autism was blamed on, quote, refrigerator mothers, unquote. That always drove me crazy. PTSD was once called shell shock and was seen as a weakness. But slowly, through advocacy, research, and a brave storytelling, the Overton window shifted. What was once pathology became identity. What was shameful became a call for justice. Today, we talk about neurodiversity, about trauma informed care, about affirming therapy. These things were fringe ideas once. Now they are reshaping schools, clinics, and media.
And the journey isn't done. From the rise of peer counseling to debates over medicating children, psychology remains a live battlefield where ideas shift constantly. The lesson? Healing begins not just with medicine, but with how we name the wound. Let's talk about child development, for example. For most of the early 20th century, John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, told parents to treat children almost like lab animals. No hugging, no picking them up when they cried. Everything could be conditioned. Watson believed that with the right environment, any child could be shaped into anything. It was a mechanistic view of human potential and it dominated early educational psychology.
Yeah. um, Hold on, Sean. I don't know that I agree with John B. Watson being the father of behaviorism. Yeah, I think there's more to it. I mean, you remember B.F. Skinner?
Yes, he played an
Uh,
important role too. This came out of earlier notions about child rearing from the 1920s.
I know, I know. Okay, I'll just leave it. Um, then along came Jean Piaget, a Swiss thinker, uh, psychologist, a Swiss thinker who dared to say, "Wait, children aren't tabula rasa or blank slates. They're thinkers, builders, meaning makers." Piaget shifted the Overton window. Suddenly, development wasn't just about shaping behavior, it was about understanding stages of cognitive growth, how children reason, question, and explore. His work redefined parenting, education, and even the legal system. Children were no longer seen as miniature adults or passive subjects. They were complex beings with inner lives. And since then, we've seen more shifts from attachment theory to emotional intelligence, from social learning, today's focus on developmental trauma. What was once radical, treating children with empathy and curiosity, is now a cornerstone of modern developmental science. The Overton window didn't just move, it grew up.
So what does all this tell us, ladies and gentlemen? Window moves. It can be pushed by kindness or cruelty, by hope or fear. But if you want change, don't wait for permission. Start pushing. One mother's voice, one priest's courage, one student's question can transform the world.
That's true. And, you know, to me, this relates to boots on the ground history, which is one of Dr. Deneen and myself. Yeah, let's start that again, which is one of the things that Dr. Deneen and myself propound and believe it is the correct way to look at things. History isn't just what happened in the past, dead stuff. Nope, nope, nope. History is past, but it's also present because the beginning of this episode is history now, right?
Indeed.
But most people would say it's present. But I don't think that's the correct way to look at it. I think it is past, it is present, and it has dramatic future importance and impact. So, as always, we want to thank you for watching Things You Don't Know, and hopefully you will come back soon.
Yes, leave us a like and leave us your comments. We always look forward to reading what people have to say about our work. And keep asking questions. And may those questions, ladies and gentlemen, always be just outside the window. Bye for now.
Keep that intellectual shovel digging. Bye.